Welcome to Quantum Flux, the podcast of Non-Local Science Fiction Magazine and NonLocalSci-Fi.com. I'm your host, the editor of Non-Local Science Fiction, Dan Dombrowski. The first issue of Non-Local Science Fiction is available now. It features 8 fantastic short stories and the first chapters of 2 thrilling serials, and you can find it on Amazon.com. Be sure to check out NonLocalSci-Fi.com for all kinds of additional content, including movie and book reviews, rereads and rewatches of genre classics, and the forums at NonLocalSci-Fi.com, an open community for sci-fi lovers from around the world where you can talk to authors from our latest issues and discuss the goings-on in the world of science fiction. I'm talking today with author and playwright Robert Paul Blumenstein, whose short story Delivery to Venus appears in issue number 1 of Non-Local Science Fiction. Welcome to the podcast, Robert.
Glad to be here.
Starting with your short story, Delivery to Venus, where did the idea come from? What drove you to write that particular story?
Well, I finished reading a book called Cosmic Memory by Rudolf Steiner, and that inspired the story. And often my reading of various science books and what have you do inspire me to write a short story. So that's where this one came from.
You dedicated the story to Rudolf Steiner. That is the dedication on it in the magazine. Is that a personal connection, or you just wanted to make sure that was in there as sort of a shout out to him?
Well, for those that are familiar with his writing, of course, it wouldn't be a personal connection because he wrote in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and I just would hope that if anybody had ever heard of him or read his books, they would say, "Oh yeah, I know where this guy's coming from," and it just kind of gives people an idea of what the story might cover or elements in the story might reflect back on Rudolf Steiner, his marvelous life and works.
Now, a lot of what you've written, and this goes for the short story as well as for all the novels and everything else you've written, a lot of it has some pretty strong religious or spiritual themes. There is a hint of that right at the end of Delivery to Venus, though it isn't a focal point. Did the story grow out of your use of religious themes elsewhere? Did you set out to write a story with some interesting spiritual undertones, or was it entirely a departure into science fiction, as you say, inspired by Rudolf Steiner, and the spiritual angle just kind of popped up because that's where your creative mind goes naturally?
Well, yes, no. Seriously, first of all, I make a distinction between spirituality and religious. I'm really not a very religious person, though I do attend church throughout the year from time to time, but I consider myself very spiritual. Now, my trilogy that I wrote, Ascension Trilogy, is based on strong Christian concepts, but not from a religious standpoint as much as just from a secular level of how people live day to day on into a spiritual realm of where people exist in that particular realm. Now, with that said, I would say that I always keep those kinds of things in mind as far as writing spiritual ideas into my work, because that's who I am. And I can't imagine my work without them. Now, my spiritual beliefs, of course, are probably a lot different than people who go to church every Sunday. I have a whole cosmology of ideas about who we are, where our soul is, where it came from, and that sort of thing. And I don't use my work as a platform to try to convey those ideas or drum those ideas in anybody's head. They're just really for contemplation, and that's what I try to do when I write. Just have ideas that we can think about.
The concept behind the story, this idea of solar evolution and the effect that it can have on life within a solar system, it's an interesting one. Where did you come up with that specific idea?
I would say that the whole idea of how we became beings is just something that I think is deeply rooted in my being, in my psyche, and I don't know if it necessarily came up with it as much as it came out of me. I do believe, and I'll just go step out on the thin ice here, but I do believe that we were at one time a race on Mars, whether we're connected to civilizations on Mars or whatever. There was something on Mars alive that gravitated to Earth. And I think it was through an evolutionary process. And I believe that that's just something that I think about and that I try to express. And perhaps I did well with Delivery to Venus. Maybe I missed the point. Who knows?
Now, in a sense, in the story, you're removing. You don't talk about religion. You don't talk about spirituality. You're removing God from the equation and giving credit to life on Earth entirely to natural forces. There's even some hinting at the possible origins of the concepts of God and religion in the human psyche. Why explore, and why, that ending? And I don't want to ruin the ending for anybody, certainly, of the story, but why go down that particular path?
Well, I think we're trying to make sense of evolution, and it comes to us through kind of a rigid format that it happened just on this earth, and it happened a certain way. And to me, there's no reason why God could not have not only used evolution for the purposes of life, but that God might be the engineering, designing force behind evolution itself. Now, I know that a statement like that does not sit very well with mainstream science. But at the same time, I don't feel like I need to be out here trying to drum any kind of philosophy or particular belief that I have into anybody. If I have something to say, listen. If you don't like it, reject it. If you think, well, maybe this is a good idea, perhaps we can start a discussion, and that would be a good thing.
Looking at your entire body of work as a writer, you've written plays, you've done quite a bit of creative nonfiction, you've got a good number of short stories out there that aren't in the science fiction genre, and then most impressively, you've got the Ascension Trilogy, which is a trilogy, three award-winning novels that have gotten some various attention and accolades. Very little of what you've published in the past falls into the science fiction genre. You do have one other short story that you list on your website, Cosmic Fugue, that received an honorable mention in the L. Ron Hubbard Writers of the Future contest in 2011. But that's about it. So do you consciously write to a specific genre? Have you avoided science fiction in the past, or you just sort of get ideas and let them come out in whatever genre they fit best?
Well, Dan, that's a good question. I really haven't been writing science fiction all my life. I've been reading it since I was a small child and learned to read. The idea that science fiction, I believe, has come to me more because I find it a better vehicle to express what I believe. And a lot of the books I read are, some of them are metaphysical in nature, some of them are what might be referred to as alternative science. I know one author I'm very fond of is Rupert Sheldrake, and his book Morphic Resonance actually inspired a story that I've written that hasn't been published. It seems that the science fiction genre seems to speak to me in a special way at this point in my life. Now, that said, right now I'm working on a novel that is actually what I think is in the genre of literary fiction. So I just think that you write what you feel will express what's inside of you, and science fiction does that well for me because I think that it keeps that idea of seeking truth and myth and the kinds of things that are inside us in our racial memory as human beings. I think it works so well for me to exploit that genre that's why I do that. Now, I don't sit down and say, well, now what genre am I going to create this story in? And as a matter of fact, I hate when publishers are so rigid with their genre. Like, if this has I wrote a story one time with a vampire on another planet, and so it was a science fiction and a vampire story, and I mean it just blew fuses of editors because it crossed genres, it mixed them up, and so I tend to say, well, I don't want to be rubber stamped into any one particular genre. Right now, science fiction is working well for me in the storytelling because I think it's helping get those questions about human existence, my existence, out into the open.
Well, so you don't like to necessarily put genre labels on the things you write, but I've actually been curious as I've looked into the things you've written, and the Ascension Trilogy specifically intrigues me. I haven't had the chance to get a copy and read it yet, but what the genre for that, it kind of escapes me reading descriptions of it. What genre would you say the Ascension Trilogy falls into?
Yeah, that was a very difficult thing to try to get those books sold because of the very problem I just mentioned with having cross genre. Because especially, I won't spoil it for anybody, but especially the third book. I mean, you could throw it out into paranormal, perhaps even a little science fiction. You could throw it into religious fiction, which that's going to be a disappointment for a lot of readers who pick up a book and say, "Oh, this is religious fiction. This is going to be maybe a parable he took out of the Bible that he made into a book," and ain't so. It's got all kinds of influences in it that are from archaeology, from science fiction, from religion, and from magical realism, and on and on. So I guess what I do is I just write what I feel, and I don't know. We'll see how it comes out in the end.
Turning more to the personal side for the moment, you mention again on your website that you grew up in the South and that religion, specifically the Presbyterian Church, was a big part of your early life. Can you tell us a little bit about your early years and how they shaped you as a writer?
Well, the religious aspect of my childhood was more of one of these things where I was sent to church more than I was taken to church. So, and the Presbyterian Church is something that was a tradition in my own family, especially my father. And I believe my mother was a Methodist, and, the Presbyterian Methodists mixed pretty well together. So it was more of, this is the way children were raised, with this religious influence. You made sure children went to church, they went to Sunday school, and they were involved. Just like in the spring and summer and fall, I was always involved in a sport. And that was kind of a thing where you made sure your children were involved in sports because it was a good and healthy thing to do. So that's really where my influence of the Presbyterian Church came from. And I would say that my experience with the Presbyterian Church has been a very liberal one, and that's probably helped me keep a more open mind about things. I'm certainly not unhappy about that.
How early did you start to write? Whether you showed a specific aptitude for it or whether you just dove in and did it and sort of felt your way through it. How old would you say you were?
Well, I was 8 years old, and I was in the third grade. And it's a story that I've heard lots and lots of people tell, so it's nothing unique or special. It's the old assignment that we had where you had two paragraphs. In my case, it was the great pumpkin was missing from the pumpkin patch. Where did it go? And you had to write two paragraphs to finish out the story, and I wrote 13 pages, and a teacher got all excited about it, but my parents were just like, "Oh, yeah, he'll spin a yarn for anybody, no big deal." And so it was just really kind of overlooked, and I didn't pursue anything in the creative writing area until I got to college. And then I found through placement testing that I had an aptitude for it, which surprised me. And then I had some very good professors who helped. They nurtured me and pushed me in the right direction so that I was able to develop a very serious attitude towards writing.
And you actually majored in playwriting.
Well, in undergraduate school, I majored in literature and we did not have a minor program, so I had to double major, and I majored in theater. So I double majored in theater and literature, but then I went to graduate school, and I received an MFA in playwriting.
Did you have specific ideas of what you wanted to do after school? Did you see yourself as a serious career playwright, or was it something that just in the moment you had the passion, so you went for it?
Well, in the moment, I had the passion, but believe it or not, it wasn't for playwriting, it was for directing. And I was a theater director, and I actually directed theater professionally. And I started a theater here in Richmond, Virginia, called the New Dominion Theater of the Deaf, and it was really deaf actors performing theater for hearing audiences, rather than what you see now, where you have political figures speaking and some guys over there signing. This was just the opposite. We had deaf actors on the stage, and we had hearing interpreters voicing for them, so that the people who could hear could follow what's going on. And that stayed in existence for a few years until Ronald Reagan became president and destroyed the National Endowment for the Arts, and I lost my job. So I guess I ended up in all kinds of careers. Some I made money, some I was a teacher, and blah, 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 blah.
The plays that the students were performing at this theater for the deaf, were they classics that the students were interpreting, or were they plays that you had written specifically for this group?
Now, these were not students. These were, adults. Some people had gotten theater training from Gallaudet, the deaf university in Washington, D.C. To answer your question, some of these were regular plays. We did a Tennessee Williams. We did a Vitkevich. We did some Chekhov. And then we wrote plays. I scripted a lot of work. I had a friend who scripted work. And what we would do with these scripts is that we would come in, we'd have hearing and our deaf actors down, and some of our actors were hearing people who signed very well. But anyway, we would sit down and we would do a translation as a theater company for these scripts, no matter what they were, and then we would get them into sign language, and then after that we'd go out and block it and stage it and what have you, and get it up for the public for public consumption.
Jumping back to college for a moment, again pulling from the bio on your website, you mention that you are part, or at least briefly part, of a Christian charismatic movement on campus. But you were actually excommunicated for speaking heresy. Can you say a little more about what happened there?
Let me see. Boy, that's harking back. Well, it was a friend of mine and I just became spirit-filled, and that's all I'll say about that. And we felt like we got to a place where we found that religion was held by preservers, people that kept things in place. And we thought that what you should do with this gift of the Spirit is to go out and make new things happen. And, of course, when you present that to a religious body, no, that does not go over very well at all. And so the religious elders of this church I belong to, they put together a council and a tribunal and all this kind of nonsense and tried us. And we were found heretics, and we were excommunicated from the church. So I guess that's all I can really tell you about it.
How would you say that experience affected your worldview? Did it discourage you at all and get rid of some of that college kid idealism?
Well, it's almost opposite. When I went into college is when I had this religious conversion, and my freshman year I was one of these, run around campus and try to convert people and that sort of thing. And this trial took place near the very end of the school year. So when I came back to college the next year, I was just a regular student, and that thing I really began to open my eyes to a lot of other things going on in the world. I would probably say my freshman year I was probably more single focus towards this religious experience. And as that happened, the world just kept opening up and getting bigger and bigger, thankfully. And when I got out of college, the reality of it was, first of all, I got out in 1975, and we had a terrible economic crisis. You would go to get a job, and maybe there were 3 positions, and the lines would go all the way around the building, and there would be hundreds and hundreds of people show up for one single job. So the reality was, you're not really prepared to do anything out here. And I got into some theater shows and stuff like that, and I was a stage manager for a show down in Atlanta, and not much really happened. I went to a place in Kentucky to work at a Appalachian Cultural Center, and I worked there as a research assistant to help a guy write a play that the Cultural Center was creating. And so all of these things just didn't really amount to anything, and that drove me to say, well, maybe I need to go back and get focused in my education. And then I went back to I went to graduate school, and I came here to Richmond, Virginia to do that.
Coming out of graduate school, then, were you able to nail down a career? Has it been the same story for you since then, where you've kind of jumped from job to job as it's come about, or did you settle down into a career at any point?
Well, I thought I was settling into a career. I had started the Theater of the Deaf. I was the artistic director. I had a viable salary. I was on my way to expanding that program and making it a full-time. Well, it was a full-time job for me, and making it something that would be a permanent fixture in the community. And America voted Ronald Reagan into office, and the first thing he did was gut the National Endowment for the Arts budget, and I lost my job. So here I am going, well, I'm back to square one again. And so at that time I went into teaching, and I taught school and for a while, and then I went out and said, well, I want to make some money, so I got into real estate.
And at all during this time, or was it once you got into real estate and you were away from the theater programs? At what point did writing as a side project sort of come in? You've had numerous plays, you've got numerous books and short stories and things out there. At what point did writing as a diversion, I guess, from maybe your day job, when did that come about?
Well, it didn't. Let me tell you what happened. When I was in real estate, I was buying rental property and investment property, and later became a real estate broker. And what I had in mind the whole time that I'm going to make enough money doing this that one day I could say adios and go into a full-time writing position. So the only thing I did to keep myself creative, other than, go to movies and films and read, was to write poetry. And I'm not a very good poet, but I wrote poetry just to keep that that creative spark alive until I could get out of this. And as it turned out, I was very successful in the real estate investment work that I did. I made a lot of money, and so there was a point, I guess, in the early 90s, and it actually kind of happened funny. My wife was coming home from work, and she said, I heard that they're looking for extras on the movie Dave, and because they were shooting that here in Richmond. And I said, oh, I don't want to fool with that. She said, no, go on, do that. And so I went in, and I actually got in as a specialty extra. I'm one of the policemen in the Capitol scenes, and I don't know, just something caught on fire. And I was like, okay, I found an agent, I got headshots made. And so I started working again in film, television, and the theater. And then I started writing screenplays, which I've written a whole lot of those, and I have even had a couple of them optioned by film companies. And then things just snowballed. And finally I said, I think I'll write a book. And so I wrote the first book of the Ascension Trilogy, Flirting with Jesus.
Now, the Ascension books, transitioning over to those, they are self-published. The hard copies are printed through, it looked like, actually three different publishing services companies. And then it looks like you handle the digital end pretty much entirely on your own. Have you had a lot of success with them? I mean, they've won awards. You know, that they're well written. They've been received well by people who judge that sort of thing. But have they been as successful as you hoped, as far as people actually buying them and reading them?
I would have liked to have developed a greater audience. I'm not, excuse me, I'm not real good at marketing these books. I will be honest with you. People now expect the writer to wear very many hats, and that's sometimes, I'm sure you found this in your own experience, and when you submit work, that the people will be more interested in your so-called marketing plan than your work itself. I've even had somebody ask for 3 sentences describing the work, but they wanted 3 pages describing my marketing plan. I don't know what to do to sell books. I really don't. I've done all the traditional things. I've done public readings. I've done TV interviews, radio interviews. I've had them reviewed. I've had interviews on the internet, the podcast. I've done all of the things that you're supposed to do that's supposed to help sell your books, but you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. So I don't know what I can do to really get people to say, I think I'll read this. For one thing, I think that's kind of tough, and that's just the way it goes. I don't apologize for this, but again, we were talking about genres earlier. These books do not easily fit into any genre. And so I know that Borders, when they first put Flirting with Jesus on their shelves, they put it in the Christian literature. Well, if you've read the book, you'll say, I don't think that belongs there. So, I wrote them, and I said, hey, look, I don't think you have this thing done correctly. And, of course, that wasn't appreciated. They didn't like me telling them how to do their job, and they may have a good point there. But, because really, if you say, well, this is our little Sunday school story for the day, Flirting with Jesus, and you pull that thing out for children, people are gonna flip out, because it's definitely adult reading material. So I think that's really what it's been kind of tough for me, is to find a way to find those people out there that would pick this up and go, yeah, this is really, really, really good. And one reason I think it's kind of tough, too, is the books are kind of disturbing. And I even have a guy say, well, they're not just disturbing. I'm wondering if the guy that wrote them is a little disturbed, too. But, that's the way I am. I think things ought to move you off of square one. You ought to not always be walking down the center of everything. You should, be pushed over to the left a little bit and pushed over to the right a little bit, and because that's what life's really about. You're knocked around, and you need to see it from all angles to really appreciate it.
Given the difficulties that you've had in getting the books out there and finding your particular audience, and even just describing what they are to people who haven't read them yet, how do you stay motivated? How do you find the energy to keep going as an independent author who isn't necessarily always getting that much attention?
I'm nuts. No, I don't know. That's a good question. I just believe in what I'm doing. I really do. I think that out there somewhere there are people who would appreciate what I've done. I also think that sometimes that this is sort of a cop-out on my part to say this, but a lot of times I think our public is told what to read, what to watch, what to eat, and what to do through our marketing methods. And I think if there was somebody out there that could get in front of a large enough group to say, yeah, you ought to really read this, that they might be more interested in my work. And the other thing that my wife keeps telling me, because she reads all my work and bounces the things back to me, she said, the problem with your work is you really have to read it a word at a time. And that's so tough on a lot of people now, because we're so busy and we have a million things to do. We don't have time to sit down and read a book one word at a time. But if you think about it, Dan, when you write a story or a book, you wrote it one word at a time. And so it's like that, you just have to read it carefully so that you get the whole picture. And I think that's kind of tough on any reader to do that. because we're kind of taught to consume in a hurry, digest it, and go on to the next thing. And I think it's hard for people to have to really sit down and kind of wade through the book, not because the writing's difficult to read or anything, but a lot of the subject matter is just, it's kind of tough and gritty.
One of the quotes from your website, from the About Me page of your website that I found most interesting, that I liked, that jumped out at me, was, and I'll read it here, quote, "I detest any type of up-in-your-face religious proselytizing and have tried to avoid that method in all 3 books of the trilogy," talking about the Ascension Trilogy. "In fiction works such as those represented in the Ascension Trilogy, I believe the subject should be nothing more than food for thought. Though I do hold strong spiritual beliefs, and they are founded upon my relationship with Christ, the last thing I intended when writing these novels was to preach to the choir." End quote. How do you differentiate when you're dealing with these themes between proselytizing and just putting some ideas out there? How do you make sure that you're keeping those two things distinct?
Well, I think the first way you do that is that you present characters who aren't necessarily obsessed with proselytizing themselves. In other words, that's not their function as a character. They're simply trying to get through life and make sense of it and be safe and successful, and all the things that we hold dear on a secular level also operate on a spiritual level as well. And now that's hard to say, because again, we're a species that's used to taking off a hat and putting another one on. We go to church, we wear a coat and tie and go to church. We may never wear that coat and tie the rest of the week, but we wear it to church because that's the costume or the uniform or whatever it is that we wear. So when I write a book, I want those characters to perform or act in such a way that they may be perceived on a spiritual level, but they're not out there preaching anything spiritual or telling people what to believe, or you have to do this or you have to do that. That you simply can see something in action, and you can see it for yourself, and then you can decide what you think about it. I think that's the best kind of writing.
Have you ever written something in the moment and then gone back to it later and thought to yourself, no, I can't use this. This is too preachy? Or are you pretty good at policing yourself as you're writing?
Well, in the early stages, I would say that I definitely have preachy work about not necessarily religious themes, but social issues. One of my favorite playwrights was Bertolt Brecht, and Brecht was very political. And so I tend to be a political creature myself, as I guess most of us are. So some of my early plays were very preachy on social themes about social change and social doctrine and political doctrine, this sort of thing. When I go back and look at those, I sometimes I chuckle, sometimes I think, well, did you really seriously think you'd get those up on a stage anywhere? And so what I do now is I don't think about themes. I think about people and situations. I think, okay, what are these people? How are they going to interact with each other? And what are they thinking and feeling? People don't necessarily think about themes and principles and what have you. They mainly act on those things. And so that's where the policing for me comes in, is to see how my characters behave opposed to what they say. And if they say preachy things, I say, well, you're not acting that out. We can't see you doing that. We can hear you, but we can't see you. So I try to keep things in action and behavior and the kinds of things that we can see for ourselves, because we can respond to that as a reader. We can respond to what we see happening. If somebody's out there shouting in our ear, we respond to that too, usually by putting our fingers in our ears.
Turning to talk about your plays again, how many would you say that you've written over the years, and then how many of those actually end up on a stage somewhere eventually?
Well, I don't know how many I've written. I've written anywhere between 10 and 20. Some of them I've written, little sketches, and some were little vignettes, and then there were full-length plays. I've had probably about 10 plays produced, and those are in various forms. So some of them were parts of one-act showcases. Some were a reader's theater, full-length. So it's been a variety, and I haven't done any theater work in a while. It's been a while. I haven't necessarily taken a hiatus. I just have been so involved in this fiction that I really haven't gone lately to the stage to write or act or direct or do anything in terms of public performance.
Is writing a play versus writing a book or a short story, are those fundamentally different processes, or are they just different means of achieving the same ends of telling a story?
Well, they're the same in the fact that they both tell a story, but they are a different process altogether. Actors can't act on ideas. Actors can only act on actions. So you have to give an actor, when you're directing him or her on the stage, you have to give her something to actually do. A lot of times when I would direct, I'd just work with actors here or there. Okay, we need you to do something. Sometimes it's okay to stand there and listen. But if you're fiddling with a book, if you're flipping the pages of a book, or you're looking out the window, or you're dusting a table, that says something about what's going on inside you, because that's an action. Now, in fiction, we have the ability to have the character reflect and share that reflection with the reader. So that's a different process altogether. So to answer your question, yes, it is a different process.
Would you say that writing a play then is more difficult? I mean, it sounds like it's more involved. I mean, you obviously have the huge variable of the actor's interpretation, the director's interpretation of what you've written, if you're not the one directing it. But just trying to get your intentions to translate onto a stage, would you say that's a lot more difficult than writing a book?
Absolutely, because the whole theater process is collaboration. And you have to collaborate with everybody. I mean, you have to even collaborate with the person dragging the costumes in. Of course, I'm speaking more from a director at that point, because sometimes playwrights, once it gets up on the stage and they start working on things. Now, I was part of the Earl Hamner Theater up around Charlottesville, and the director there would have the playwrights constantly rewriting work, and she sent stuff back saying, well, this isn't working, you need to rewrite this scene, and so you'd have to go rewrite it. And that's very difficult, because sometimes you're like, well, I think this is fine. And then if everybody else thinks, no, it's not, guess what? They're not gonna pull off what you think's working fine. They're gonna show you that it doesn't work. So you might have to give up something. Whereas in a book, you can pretty much say, no, this is the way it is. If we want to clean it up, or say things a different way or whatever, then we can do that. But in theater, it's really a collaborative effort, and it is much more difficult. And the second thing, if I could just add this to it, is that the hardest thing to do on the theater is to make that dialogue believable. That's very difficult to do, because this is not just people speaking ideas, or their words can't simply be a vehicle for the story to be conveyed. That dialogue has to sound like real people having a real conversation, and all underneath is the story, the plot, the subplots, everything's moving along there, and including subtext, the things they're not telling you that's going on. That's very difficult.
With how complex everything is, and all the different things that you have to consider when writing for the stage, does that translate over? Does that make you a stronger prose fiction writer?
Well, I think in the dialogue it does. I had a critic one time tell me that I shouldn't be writing prose. He said, that's just not what you're about. He said, you have dialogue down very well. You need to stay with that. Get off this fiction stuff. I don't know. That's his opinion.
So if you had to, I mean, obviously you've said you don't write a whole lot of plays anymore. You've been focusing more on the prose. But if you had to go back and start over and choose just one, writing books or writing for the stage, which one do you think you would choose?
Oh, I know that you really like those kinds of either-or questions, and those are always tough because, you get so much out of both areas. You get. I've gotten so much out of the theater that I've been able to bring to prose. I've gotten so much out of prose that I've been able to bring to the theater. I think if I were to, to be fair and answer your question, I believe I would probably stay with writing for the theater because I just think that there's such a greater dynamic. The problem I would have is that you wouldn't be able to curl up in bed at night and take a play to bed, even though I've read hundreds of plays and enjoy reading plays just as plays. They fall short because they really were written to be performed on the stage. And in a way, it's almost like the difference between photography and oil painting. They're both pictures and what have you, but they're so different from each other that it's really hard to say that an either or would work for one or the other artist.
What do you read for fun? What do you read on the side? Do you even have a whole lot of time for it? I find anymore that I'm mostly reading things that I have to read. I don't have a whole lot of time to read the things I want to read anymore.
One of the things I have done, I've eliminated the paper newspaper, and I get so I read my newspaper online. I don't think I'm getting any more information, by the way. I think I'm getting the same edited stories that I used to get on print. So that's kind of helped balance that out because I would read the newspaper and go online. So I like to switch. I like to read a nonfiction book, and then I like to read a fiction book. I just finished Scanner Darkly, and now I'm reading Hamlet's Mill. So I like to switch back and forth between nonfiction and fiction.
Who would you say is your favorite science fiction author, if you have one? What's your favorite science fiction book?
My favorite author is Philip Dick. I just think he was a great writer. He was wonderful. I would also have to, I guess, put Ray Bradbury in there. I don't know that I have a favorite book. It's, to me, a book is just each one is such a unique experience that you just go and immerse yourself in that world and you visit and you take some of it with you. A lot of it's just like when you travel overseas. We remember, I've been all over England. I remember Stonehenge, and, I can bring that image up in my mind. But it was so totally different being there at Stonehenge than it was to think about being there. So books are like that for me, too. When I'm in the book, I'm in that world. And when I finish the book, I leave that world. So it's hard for me to think back, like, what was a favorite of all time? I guess I really don't have one.
What do you hate to read? What quote-unquote classic or quote-unquote must-read modern book have you picked up and then put down pretty quickly because it just didn't work for you?
Probably perspecti for different mutual funds and that sort of thing. I hate reading legalese, but you have investments, you have legal documents you must go through, so you have to know how to read those things and go through them. But that's what I hate reading the most. In terms of any kind of nonfiction book, I guess I wouldn't really pick one up that I didn't want to read in the first place. I know sometimes I'll pick up a book and it is just such a terrible read that I just can't finish it. But I don't generally pick up a nonfiction book that I don't want to read, that hasn't already piqued my curiosity because of the subject matter or whatever.
Anything on the fiction side of things that you've picked up and just been unable to get through?
Oh my! I don't know if I should answer that question. That would really hurt somebody's feelings. Yes, I have. There was a particular book. I really can't name it. You'll just have to forgive me for that, but I can't do that to a fellow author. But This thing was a bestseller. It was made in a movie. I picked it up. I got through chapter 1. Can't read it. Picked it up. Got through chapter 1 and 2. Can't read it. Picked it up. Got through chapter 1, 2, and 3 and said, this is ridiculous. I cannot read this stuff, and put it down. And it not only was a best-selling book, it became a blockbuster movie. So that said, yes, that has happened.
You mentioned earlier about another book that you're working on, about some plans for the future. Is this going to be another multi-book arc like Ascension, or is this a smaller project?
No, this is not going to be a trilogy. It's just a single book, and it's just about a person who lives in Richmond, Virginia, where I live.
What advice do you have for young writers, for somebody just starting out? Is there some, obviously there's no one key to success, but what would you say is the most important thing for young writers to remember?
Well, if I may quote from a person who answered that question for me many years ago, and he answered it. He said, "Write every day without fail, even if it's only for half an hour. Even if you're savagely hungover and your grandmother has just fallen out of a third-story window." And that came from a guy named Tom Robbins. And he answered this for me as to what I could do to be a better writer. And actually that came earlier in my life in college when I was, really trying to struggle with how to write prose. And we didn't have a creative writing teacher who was a prose writer. He was actually I think he was a poet laureate for North Carolina for at one point in his life, and he was very good. He's a great poet, and he could help you in poetry, and he was a great resource. But when it came to prose, he just said, it's not my forte. I really can't help you. So I went to my advisor for my literature major, and he said, I want you to go and get a notebook. He said, you can get one of these fancy, hardback type of things, or just get a, theme notebook. He said, you sit down and you write in that book every day, no matter, even if you don't feel like it. If you just want to say what you had to eat for that day or whatever. But you make sure that you write something down every day. And of course, that was all by hand. So when you're writing by hand, you have to be a little more economical about what you're writing. And it created a good discipline in me to write every day, and it helped me develop a thinking process that goes on in a writer's mind. It's not the same thing as when you and I are sitting on the phone here talking. The writing process is a different kind of process of what's up here that has to travel all the way from that brain through your shoulder, your neck, your shoulder, your arms, and into your fingers and out your fingertips, because I'm on the keyboard now, but of course it was a pen back then. And so that's what's helped me, and I would say that to any writer, because there's a lot of, and the other thing I would say to writers is read a lot. And a lot of writers already do, but I've actually met some writers that will tell me they hate to read. And that just makes me, gasp for breath. How can you possibly want to be a great writer or writer and you don't read? You have to read. And so that's the two things, is they write every day and read every day without fail.
Once again, I've been talking with Robert Paul Blumenstein, author of Delivery to Venus, a short story that appears in the first issue of Non-Local Science Fiction. Thanks for being here today, Robert. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking with you, and I thank you for having me on the show. I would like to say one thing, that to thank you for your tireless work that you have done on this project. I have been amazed that somebody could put out expend the kind of energy that you have done, expended on this project to make it a success. And I just am in awe of all that you have done. And I really hope that the whole 33rd Street Publishing project becomes something really, really great in time, because I think the work you've done, it certainly deserves a great tale of success in the future.
Once again, I've been talking with author Robert Paul Blumenstein. Robert's short story Delivery to Venus appears in issue number 1 of Non-Local Science Fiction, available now on nonlocalsci-fi.com. Thanks for listening to this episode of Quantum Flux, the podcast of Non-Local Science Fiction Magazine and nonlocalsci-fi.com. Subscribe to this podcast through iTunes or on our YouTube channel so that you never miss an episode. Music was provided by Kevin MacLeod through incomtech.com.